Harlow Bellamy cooked all morning with one hand, because the other one couldn't lift past her shoulder anymore. Gauze covered the left side of her face, her neck, and most of her left arm, the side that had taken the heat when she crawled back into a burning apartment 4 months earlier and dragged Trevor Beckett out by his collar. He'd coughed for 2 days and gone back to work. She'd lost her face, her job in the emergency room, and every plan she'd ever made. She set the table for 2 anyway, because there were things she still wanted to say to him. Then, at noon, the door opened, and Trevor walked in with a woman half a step behind him. He didn't stop at the table. He didn't look at the food. He went straight into the bedroom, and Harlow sat there listening to the closet doors and the sound of a suitcase being packed by a man who wasn't in any hurry. When he came back out, he had that suitcase in one hand and his other arm around the woman waiting by the door. He said one sentence to Harlow, on his way past her, the kind of sentence a woman doesn't forget for the rest of her life, and then he pulled the suitcase out of the apartment, and the door clicked shut behind them both. Harlow sat down in front of the meal she'd spent all morning making. She picked up the knife and the fork and held them until her knuckles went white, and she cried without making a sound, because there was nobody left in that apartment to hear it. 40 minutes later, somebody knocked. She almost didn't answer. The man standing in the hallway wore a black overcoat, and he wouldn't step inside until she told him he could. In that city, people said his name carefully, or they didn't say it at all, and he had come looking for her. If Harlow's story moves you, leave a like and tell us what you think in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's get back to the story. Harlow pushed herself up from the chair with her right hand, bracing against the edge of the table, and walked to the door. The man in the hallway didn't knock a second time. He stood exactly 1 step away from the door, both hands hanging at his sides, holding nothing, and when she opened it, he didn't move any closer. "May I come in?" It wasn't the kind of polite question people asked while already stepping through the doorway. He actually waited. Harlow looked at him for 3 seconds, then stepped back once, and nodded. He crossed the threshold and closed the door behind him with one hand, so gently that the latch barely made a sound. His eyes swept across the dining table. 2 plates. The chicken had gone completely cold. The fat congealed into a cloudy ring around the edge of the plate. The knife and fork were still lying where she'd dropped them. He looked at them for exactly 2 seconds, then looked away, and he didn't say a single word about any of it. Harlow had prepared herself for pity in his eyes, or a question about whether she was all right. Or worse, the way people glanced at the layers of bandages and then hurriedly lowered their eyes to the floor. He did none of those things. He looked directly at her face, at both the left side and the right, as though the two were the same. "Do you remember me?" "I don't think so." "Good." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, took out a card, and placed it on the table beside the cold dinner. It was plain white, with no name, no logo, only a string of numbers printed across the center. Harlow stared at it, and something inside her chest seemed to slip half a beat. She had seen that card before. She couldn't remember where, but she had seen it. "You're trying to remember." He said nothing more. He simply reached down, pulled the left side of his shirt free from his waistband, and lifted it just enough. Beneath his ribs, angling toward his hip, was a scar about the length of 3 finger joints. It wasn't smooth. The stitches had been spaced unevenly, tight in some places and wide in others, and the healed edges of the skin sat crookedly against each other. It wasn't the work of an operating room. It was something someone had done in the dark, quickly, with whatever had been within reach. "You did this in the basement supply room." Harlow didn't move. "A 3/0 needle. You used the wrong size because it was the only one left in the box." She heard the air conditioner inside the wall run for a moment and then shut off. She heard a bus on Bridgeport Street squeal as it braked at the stop. Then she turned, walked to the small cabinet against the wall, and pulled open the second drawer. Inside was the jumble of things she'd dragged out of her old apartment after the fire. Things that hadn't burned completely. Things she hadn't had the strength to sort through. Receipts. A roll of elastic bandage. A broken hair clip. And at the very bottom, a plain white card, its edges slightly yellowed, with a string of numbers printed across the center. She picked it up, walked back to the table, and placed it beside the card he'd just set down. The two were identical. The same paper, the same typeface, the same string of numbers. 3 years in a drawer hadn't made one any different from the other. "You're the man from the parking lot." He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either. He let the hem of his shirt fall, straightened it neatly, and stood upright again. "My name is Vincenzo Vaccaro," and that last name dropped into the middle of the room like something heavy. Harlow had lived in Chicago all her life. She had worked the night shift in the emergency room for 4 straight years. The place where everything this city didn't want to look at was carried in by ambulance at 2 o'clock in the morning. She had heard that name in hallways, tucked between two sentences, always spoken more quietly, always followed by a brief silence. She had heard a resident ask a patient who had done this to him, and the patient had only shaken his head. She had watched a veteran nurse cross out one line in a chart and rewrite it as something else. In this city, there were family names people said aloud to show off, and there were family names people spoke very carefully, or didn't speak at all. You understand now. I understand. Vincenzo gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't explain anything more. He didn't tell her what he did, didn't tell her where he stood in this city. He didn't need to. That silence said more than anything he could have put into words. He also didn't move one step closer. From the moment he'd entered, he had remained exactly where he was, a short distance from the dining table, his hands at his sides. He didn't sit down. He didn't touch anything. And that was what sent a chill along Harlow's spine. Because a man who kept his distance that carefully inside the apartment of a woman who had only one usable arm was a man who knew exactly what he could do if he chose to. She reached out with her right hand and gripped the edge of the chair. For 4 months, she had believed this day couldn't possibly get any worse. She had thought she'd hit bottom at the exact moment the door had closed at noon. But now, standing inside her own apartment before a cold dinner and 2 identical white cards lying side by side on the table, Harlow Bellamy realized something even more unsettling. She was standing in the same room with the man all of Chicago was afraid to name. 3 years earlier, Harlow was 24 and had just finished her 4th 12-hour shift of the week. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the employee parking lot behind the emergency department was almost empty, with only the night shift cars scattered beneath the tall overhead lights, 2 of which had been broken since summer. She was walking toward her own car, one hand fishing for her keys, her mind still calculating how much she was short on rent that week, when she heard someone breathe. It wasn't a groan, just one long breath, quick and shallow, coming from the darkness between 2 rows of cars. Harlow stopped. Someone else might have kept walking, but a year on the emergency room night shift had already taught her to recognize the sound of a body losing blood, and her feet turned toward it before her mind had time to weigh the decision. The man was sitting against the rear tire of a truck, one leg stretched out, one hand pressed hard against his left side. A whole section of his shirt had gone dark, and the stain was still spreading. He looked up at her. No panic, no pleading, just a steady look. The look of someone calculating whether she was a threat or an opportunity. Harlow dropped to her knees and pulled her phone from the pocket of her scrub top. I'm calling an ambulance. He caught her wrist. Not hard, not enough to hurt, but firmly enough that she couldn't dial. Don't. You're losing blood. You know the law in this state. And she did. In Illinois, any hospital that received a gunshot wound was required to notify the police. No exceptions, no gray areas. The moment he crossed through those emergency room doors, there would be 2 officers standing at the foot of his bed within 20 minutes. He knew that, and he'd just made sure she knew that he knew. Harlow looked at the hand around her wrist. Then she looked at the dark pool spreading across the pavement. She could stand up, walk to her car, drive home, and never mention this to anyone. No one had seen her here. No one could blame her. She pulled her wrist free, slipped the phone back into her pocket, and moved around to his left side. Can you stand? Yes. Then don't talk. Save your strength for walking. She let him brace himself against her right shoulder and took him inside through the rear service entrance, the door the orderlies used when they wheeled trash carts outside, the only door in the building without a camera lens pointed directly at it. 37 steps to the stairwell, 19 stairs down to the basement. The supply room was at the end of the hall, and Harlow had a key because she was the one who fetched supplies for the entire shift. She locked the door from the inside, pulled out a stool, and made him sit. Then she went to work. She cut open his shirt, packed the wound with gauze, found the source of the bleeding, and realized it was a penetrating wound that hadn't entered the abdominal cavity, the bullet path lying shallow within the muscles of the abdominal wall. That meant he wasn't going to die in the next half hour, but it also meant the bullet was still inside him. She opened the cabinet and took out lidocaine, forceps, scissors. The suture box on the shelf had only one spool left. 3-0, the kind used for fascia. Far too thick for what she was about to do. She took it anyway because there was nothing else. This is going to hurt. Do it. He didn't make a sound. For the entire 15 minutes. The only thing that came from him was his breathing, and the way his fingers tightened around the edge of the stool until the wood creaked. Harlow removed the bullet, dropped it into an enamel tray, and the sound of metal striking metal rang through the sealed room. She irrigated the wound, stitched it closed, and counted every suture. 9 stitches, spaced unevenly, because her hand had started to tremble by the 6th, and because the thread in her hand was the wrong size. She knew the scar would be ugly. She also knew an ugly scar was still better than a body in a parking lot. At around 3 o'clock, he began to drift in and out from the blood loss and the medication. His head tipped to one side, his eyes half open, and he said something in a low voice, unclear who he was speaking to. "Rocco, don't." Harlow was tying the final stitch. She didn't stop. She didn't ask him to repeat himself, didn't look up, didn't turn the name over in her mind. Her time in the emergency room had taught her that people said all kinds of things when they were hurting and afraid, and that most of those things weren't meant for her to hear. She cut the suture, taped gauze over the wound, and stood to wash her hands. She placed a blister pack of antibiotics from the sample cabinet on his lap, along with a sheet of paper with the dosage written in capital letters. Then she told him he needed a real doctor, in a real medical facility, as soon as possible, and that she'd done everything she could do inside a storage room. He nodded. He asked her name. She told him she didn't want to say. He didn't ask a second time. Harlow went back upstairs to return the key and finish handing over her paperwork, which took about 40 minutes. When she came back down, the supply room was empty. The stool had been returned to exactly where it had been before. The bloodied gauze had been gathered into a medical waste bag and tied shut. And on the steel counter lay a plain white card with no name, no logo, only a string of numbers printed across the center. Harlow picked it up, turned it over in her hand, then slipped it into her pocket. At 4 o'clock in the morning, she drove home. She told no one. She didn't search for his name online. Didn't ask security whether the cameras had caught anything. Didn't read the local news the next morning to see whether anyone had been shot somewhere in the city. She tossed the card into a drawer with a pile of bills and forgot about it within a week. The man never forgot a single day. The reason Harlow kept taking night shifts was that nights paid an extra $4 an hour, and $4 an hour multiplied by 36 hours a week was what determined how much she could put toward her student debt that month. The amount she owed when she finally earned her nursing degree was $62,800. She was 24, had been making payments for a full year, and still owed $58,000. The interest swallowed almost everything she paid toward the principal each month, so the balance went down the way water went down when someone was bailing out a leaking boat. She aged out of the foster care system on the exact day she turned 18. No one signed papers for her. No one came to pick her up. And there was no one she could call when her first year of nursing school demanded a $4,000 deposit she didn't have. She worked as a waitress for 3 years to save what she could, then borrowed the rest. That was the whole story, and Harlow had never told it to anyone in more than 3 sentences. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport, $1,150 a month, on the 3rd floor with no elevator. She chose it because it was a 17-minute drive from the hospital, and because the landlord accepted 1 month's deposit instead of 2. On the days she worked, she ate in the hospital cafeteria so she wouldn't have to buy food, and she brought home the leftover packets of instant coffee from the staff break room. When the washing machine in the building basement broke, she washed her clothes by hand and hung them from a line stretched across the bathroom for 4 straight months because the landlord wouldn't fix it. Harlow met Trevor Beckett one October afternoon while she was standing outside a grocery store with a paper bag that had split open at the bottom and her groceries rolling across the sidewalk. He was the one who stopped. He helped pick everything up, walked with her for 3 blocks, and asked for her phone number at the corner. He worked as a real estate broker for a small office in Bridgeport, specializing in rental apartments and older houses in the neighborhood. During the first 3 weeks they knew each other. He mentioned 4 deals that were about to close. Over the next 2 years, he mentioned no fewer than 40 more. There was one he talked about for 2 straight months, a 6-unit apartment building in Pilsen, with a commission big enough for the 2 of them to fly somewhere and spend a week away. It didn't close. There was another, a row of townhouses in Cicero, that he said was only waiting on bank approval. That one didn't close either. Whenever Harlow asked, he always had an answer, and the answer was always reasonable. And there was always someone else's name attached to the reason it had fallen apart. A buyer who changed his mind, an appraiser who was too difficult, a coworker who stepped in and cut him out. He moved in with her after 7 months. It began as a temporary arrangement, 3 weeks while he looked for another place. 3 weeks became 3 months, and then he gave up his old place entirely. The lease remained in her name until the landlord redid the paperwork the following year, and Trevor told her to put it in his name because this was his business, because he knew how to talk to landlords, because she worked nights and didn't have time to sit there signing 3 rounds of paperwork. Harlow agreed. She was still the one who transferred the rent on the first of every month, 27 months in a row. There were 3 months when he gave her part of it, and one of those 3 times, he borrowed the money back the following week. She didn't keep records. She thought keeping records was something people did once they had already started thinking about leaving. What kept Harlow there wasn't the promises. It was the mornings. She came home at 7:30 after a night shift, and someone was there. Someone asked how the night had gone. Someone had coffee waiting. In the first 24 years of her life, Harlow had never walked into a room, knowing for certain that someone was waiting for her to come through the door. She had lived with 7 foster families, and in every one of those homes, she had been the person who kept a neatly packed bag under the bed in case she had to leave. Trevor was the first person who never told her to go. She loved him for that, and later she wouldn't be ashamed of it, because for someone who had never had anyone stay, one person staying was enough to make her trade away a great many things. Jenna Whitaker, the nurse who worked the same shift as her, saw what Harlow couldn't see. Once, Jenna asked her outright how much he contributed toward the rent, and Harlow answered that he was going through a rough stretch, that real estate was like that. Some months you made nothing, and then 1 month paid for the whole year. Jenna didn't ask a second time. A best friend knew when silence was more useful. That spring, Trevor bought her a promise ring, a thin band with tiny stones. He told her it was only a first step, that when the Pilsen deal closed, there would be a proper one. Harlow wore it. She didn't need a proper one. She only needed this one not to disappear. 3 weeks before the night of the fire, Trevor started coming home later than usual, and he started checking his phone in a way he hadn't before. Harlow thought it was because another deal was about to fall apart. In one sense, she had guessed correctly. She had simply been completely wrong about what was falling apart, and about who would end up paying the price for it. That night, Harlow was off duty, the first shift she'd had off in 11 days. She went to bed at 11 o'clock. Trevor came home close to 1 in the morning, and she knew because she heard the key scrape against the lock 3 times before the door finally opened. He stumbled into the chair in the kitchen. She sat up, switched on the hallway light, and saw him standing there with one hand braced against the wall. "How much did you drink?" "Not much." He didn't look at her when he said it. He told her he was going to sleep in the room at the end of the hall, the small room he used for paperwork, so he wouldn't disturb her. That wasn't unusual. He did that whenever he came home in that condition, and Harlow had grown so used to it that she no longer considered it an event worth noticing. She turned off the hallway light, went back into the bedroom, and fell asleep again within 10 minutes. At 3 o'clock in the morning, she woke up coughing. There was no fire alarm. Investigators later determined that the battery had been removed from the smoke detector inside the apartment, and Harlow would never remember the last time she'd checked it. She shot upright in bed. The air in the room was thick and warm, and there was a smell she recognized immediately after 4 years in the emergency room, the smell of burning plastic. She rolled out of bed onto the floor, crawled to the door, and pressed the back of her hand against it. It wasn't hot. She opened it. The hallway was full of smoke, and at the far end, where the corridor turned toward the living room, orange light flickered across the ceiling. She screamed his name. "Trevor." No answer. She screamed again. Still nothing. The smoke dropped lower very quickly, forcing her face close to the floor. An instinct carried her toward the front door because that was the route she knew. 11 steps. Her right hand sliding along the edge of the wall, she made it into the common hallway, ran down 3 flights of stairs, and stood on the sidewalk. She called 911. She gave the address, said 3rd floor, said there was still a man inside. The dispatcher asked whether she was safely outside, and told her to stay exactly where she was, because help was on the way. Harlow stayed where she was. She stayed there for exactly 30 seconds. She looked up at the 3rd floor window and waited for Trevor to appear at the building entrance behind her. He didn't. Neighbors were beginning to run outside. A man from the 1st floor, a woman holding a cat in her arms. None of them was Trevor, and Harlow realized something very simple. He was drunk. He was asleep in the room at the end of the hallway, the farthest point from the exit. He hadn't heard her screaming. She looked toward the end of the street. No fire engine lights, no sirens. She didn't know whether it would be 4 minutes or 7, and she knew exactly what smoke could do to an unconscious person in that amount of time. She handed her phone to the woman holding the cat, and she went back inside. Someone behind her shouted for her to stop. She didn't stop. 3 flights of stairs. The apartment door was still open exactly as she'd left it. Inside, it was much hotter than it had been 6 minutes earlier, and she stayed low, nearly crawling, moving back through the same hallway she'd just escaped from. The section of wall on the left, near the turn, had caught fire and was burning upward along the ceiling. She passed it the first time by staying close to the right side, and made it to the room at the end of the hall. Trevor was lying on the floor one step from the bed, still fully dressed. He had tried to get up and hadn't been able to. She shook his shoulder. She called his name twice. There was no response. He outweighed her by at least 66 pounds. Harlow didn't think. She knelt behind him, slid both arms beneath his armpits, locked her hands across his chest, and pulled. He moved about 1.5 feet. She drew a breath, changed her position, and pulled again. The floor dragged beneath his body. She backed up one step at a time. Her eyes closed most of the way because of the smoke, and she counted silently in her head, not to know how far she'd gone, but to keep herself from passing out. When she reached the turn, she had to pass the burning wall a second time. This time she was moving backward and dragging another person, so she couldn't stay tight against the right side anymore. She had to go through the middle. She twisted her body so that her back shielded his head, and the entire left side of her body took the fire. She didn't stop. She remembered thinking exactly one thing, that if she let go now, both of them would die there, and so she didn't let go. She reached the door. She reached the common hallway, 3 flights of stairs, dragging him down, stopping once at every step. On the first floor, 2 neighbors ran over to help, and together they carried Trevor the final distance out of the building. Harlow followed behind them on her own feet, walked all the way to the sidewalk, and only then did she collapse. She heard the fire engine sirens coming from the direction of the main road at the exact moment her back struck the concrete. They told her later that the fire engine arrived exactly 1 minute and 10 seconds after she made it outside. Trevor regained consciousness in the ambulance. He spent 2 nights in the hospital under observation for smoke inhalation, coughed for 2 days, then was discharged and went back to work on Monday. Trevor lived because Harlow went back for him. What he didn't tell the investigators the next morning was that he'd known beforehand that something like this could happen. Harlow spent 9 days in the burn unit before anyone told her the whole truth. During those 9 days, they gave it to her in pieces, the way people always did with patients. A little at a time, just enough for her to bear. She knew that method. She had once been the person doing it to someone else. On the 10th day, Dr. Adele Krauss pulled a chair beside the bed, placed the chart across her lap, and didn't open it. "You're a nurse, 4 years in the emergency room. Then I'm going to speak to you the way I'd speak to a colleague. If you want me to say it differently, tell me." Harlow said she didn't need that. Krauss nodded, then began. Deep 2nd-degree and 3rd-degree burns, distributed across the left half of her face, the left side of her neck, and the outer portion of her left upper arm extending down into part of the forearm. The 3rd-degree areas wouldn't reepithelialize on their own. They would require skin grafts, and the grafting wouldn't be a single procedure. There would be donor site surgeries, revision surgeries, and 6-month intervals between some procedures to allow the tissue to stabilize. Krauss said the likely number of surgeries was somewhere between 4 and 7, and she immediately made clear that it was only an estimate, that every body responded differently, and that she wouldn't promise anything about the final result, because she had no right to. Harlow listened to all of it. She nodded where she was supposed to nod. Then she asked the question she'd been carrying inside her chest for 9 days. "How long before I can work a shift again?" Krauss was silent for about 3 seconds. They were the longest 3 seconds of Harlow's life. That's the part I need to explain carefully. She opened the chart, turned it toward Harlow, and pointed to 2 lines. The problem wasn't her face. The problem was her left armpit and forearm. The burn crossed the axillary fold and the flexor surface of the elbow, and when burn scar tissue healed, it contracted, drawing the 2 ends toward each other and fixing a joint in the position the scar preferred rather than the position the body needed. There was physical therapy. There were positioning splints. There were surgeries to release contractures. All of those things could slow the process, and none of them could restore her old range of motion completely. "Give me a number. I expect you can recover roughly 60 to 70% of the range of motion in your left shoulder if you work seriously at therapy for 2 years. The forearm should do better, but you won't be able to lift heavy objects overhead with your left arm, and you won't be able to maintain steady force with the shoulder abducted beyond 45 degrees. Harlow looked up at the ceiling. She didn't need Krauss to explain anything further. She knew exactly what that meant, because she'd done that job every night for 4 years. Emergency nursing was a 2-arm profession. It was rolling a man who weighed nearly 200 pounds onto his side into a safe recovery position. It was transferring a patient from stretcher to bed with a slide sheet, 3 people together, counting 1, 2, 3. It was performing chest compressions for 15 straight minutes without letting the force weaken. It was holding down a struggling hand while someone else placed an intravenous line. It was reaching up to a high rack for a bag of fluids while your feet were still moving. No one in an emergency room worked with one arm, not because anyone forbade it, but because the patient would pay the price. It had taken her 11 years to go from an 18-year-old girl walking out of foster care with a bag in her arms to the employee badge hanging against her chest. This doctor had taken 4 minutes to tell her it was over. Is there anything else I can do in nursing? Yes, a great deal. But I'm not going to sit here and list those things for you today, because today you won't hear a word of it. Kraus closed the chart and stood. She didn't tell Harlow everything would be all right. She didn't tell her she was young. She only said she would come back on Thursday, and that if Harlow had questions, she should write them down, because patients always forgot the most important one when the doctor was standing in front of them. Margot Kessler, the head nurse in the emergency department, came to see her 2 days later carrying a stack of paperwork. She had already opened a long-term medical leave case, filed for temporary disability benefits through the hospital's insurance plan, and kept Harlow's position on hold instead of terminating it. She was equally direct about the rest. The benefit would cover 60% of Harlow's wages for a maximum of 26 weeks. The hospital's health insurance would cover most of the acute treatment, but some of the reconstructive procedures later on would be classified under cosmetic categories, and those portions Harlow would have to pay for herself. Margot didn't apologize for the numbers. She simply laid the paperwork on the bedside table and said she would hold Harlow's position for as long as she possibly could. That night, Trevor came after visiting hours. He stood at the foot of the bed for a long time without coming closer. Then he sat down, took her right hand, and cried. He truly cried. The kind that shook his shoulders and left him unable to finish a full sentence for the first 2 minutes. He told her he didn't deserve that she'd gone back for him. He told her he'd been lying there on the floor and hadn't known anything that was happening. Then he said the sentence Harlow would remember for the next 4 months. I'll be here, every appointment, every surgery, however long it takes. Harlow believed him. She believed him because she'd spent 24 years searching for one person who wouldn't leave, and because in that moment, the man crying beside her hospital bed sounded exactly like the thing she'd been looking for. Trevor kept his promise for exactly 1 month, and during that month, he kept it very well. He rented another apartment in Bridgeport, 6 blocks from the old place, and moved in before Harlow was discharged, so she would have somewhere to come home to. He drove her to all 4 of her follow-up appointments. He learned how to remove the dressings in the exact order the nurse had taught him, how to apply the medication without rubbing, how to wrap everything again without making it too tight. He set the medication alarms on his own phone instead of hers. For the first 3 weeks, there was coffee waiting every morning. Then, in the 5th week, there was an afternoon when he sat in the plastic surgery waiting room staring down at his phone for 20 straight minutes. When she came out, he had to look up twice before he noticed her. That was the first time. Harlow thought he was busy with work. In the 6th week, she sat down at the dining table, and the dressing at her neck shifted slightly, exposing a patch of skin that was beginning to reepithelialize. Trevor looked away. He didn't flinch, didn't grimace, simply turned his head toward the window and kept it there until she adjusted the gauze. He said nothing. Neither did she. She told herself he felt guilty because she looked like this, because of him. In the 8th week, he started sleeping in the small room. The reason was his early morning schedule. The office was working on a new project. He had to be there at 6 o'clock, and he didn't want his alarm waking her when she needed sleep to heal. It made so much sense that Harlow actually thanked him. 3 weeks later, she realized he was still sleeping in the small room on Saturday nights, when there wasn't an office anywhere opening at 6 the next morning. She didn't ask. Around the same time, his phone started appearing face down on the table. It wasn't something he did once. It became a habit, consistent and automatic, every time he set the phone down on any surface in the apartment. When a call came in, he picked it up, walked into the common hallway, and only then answered. Whenever Harlow asked who had called, the answer was always a client. Then came the trips. At first, it was 1 night away, meeting an out-of-town client, a landowner in western Illinois. Then it was 2 nights, then 3. He told her about them roughly 2 hours beforehand, sometimes less. Harlow was the one left home alone with dressings that needed to be changed twice a day, and an arm she could only raise to chest height, and she learned how to do everything with her right hand because she didn't want him to have to cancel work. In the 3rd month, the attorney for the old building called. The building owner had agreed to settle the civil liability claim for $240,000. Investigators had concluded that the smoke alarm system and the electrical wiring in that section of the building weren't up to code, and the landlord's liability insurer chose to settle rather than go to court. The person named to receive the settlement was the tenant who had signed the lease. The lease was in Trevor Beckett's name. He told Harlow that the money was for her medical bills, all of them, and that she didn't have to worry about anything anymore. She believed him. She had no reason not to, because she had never had to check up on him about money, because for 27 straight months, she had been the one transferring the rent. 6 weeks later, she received the first overdue notice from the hospital. She assumed it was an administrative mistake, the kind of thing that happened all the time in the American healthcare system. She put it in a drawer. One Saturday afternoon during that same period, Trevor was attending the opening of a new apartment development in the South Loop, standing inside a model unit on the 9th floor. Sienna Marsh was 24 and worked in communications for the development company, and that day was the first time she'd gone out to the property in place of a coworker who was homesick. Trevor helped her answer a buyer's question about management fees that she hadn't learned yet. Before shaking her hand, he slipped the promise ring off his ring finger and put it into his pants pocket. When Sienna asked whether he had a family, he said no. He told her he lived alone, that lately he'd been a little busy because he was helping an old roommate who had been in an accident, a fire, something pretty tragic, and she had no close family, so he'd stepped in to help take care of things. Sienna remembered thinking he was a kind man. She had no way of knowing that the woman he was talking about was the woman who had dragged him out of that fire. It would take her nearly a year to find out. Jenna Whitaker came to visit one evening the following month. She brought food, stayed for 3 hours, and during those 3 hours, Harlow's phone didn't ring once. Where is he? Meeting a client. In Rockford. He was gone the last time I came to. That's real estate, Jenna. Some months there's nothing. Jenna set the food container down on the table and looked at her. Being busy doesn't explain why you're always here alone. Harlow answered too quickly, faster than she needed to. She said he'd been there for her through the entire first month, that he'd learned how to change the dressings, that he'd taken time off work to drive her to appointments. She said he was carrying all the rent and all the medical bills while she wasn't earning a single dollar. She said she was the one who owed him, not the other way around. Jenna didn't argue. She simply stayed long enough to wash the dishes and then went home. 3 weeks later, Trevor told her he would come home for lunch on Friday, the first time in more than 2 months. That Friday morning, Harlow got up at 7 o'clock, walked to the corner store, and started cooking. Vincenzo remained exactly where he had been standing. Harlow released her grip on the edge of the chair and asked the only question left. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to offer you a job." For a moment, she thought she'd heard him wrong. He continued, slowly, one part at a time, like a man reading the terms of an agreement rather than trying to persuade her. He needed a private nurse, not a doctor, not a surgeon. He needed someone who could handle the things the people around him couldn't take to an emergency room, because the moment they did, there would be officers standing at the foot of the bed within 20 minutes, and because some wounds couldn't be explained away with any story. Cleaning wounds, debriding dead tissue, suturing skin, starting intravenous lines, administering antibiotics, watching for signs of infection, reading results and knowing when someone truly had to be transferred elsewhere. That's work for a pair of skilled hands, not a pair of strong ones. You don't need to lift anyone. You don't need to run. Harlow said nothing. She understood immediately what he meant. She had heard Dr. Krause tell her that she would never again be able to hold her left shoulder beyond 45 degrees with steady force, and she had understood that it meant emergency nursing was over. But suturing a laceration could be done from almost any position. Starting an intravenous line only required a hand that didn't shake. This man had studied her limitations very carefully before crossing her threshold, and he was offering her exactly the part of the job those limitations couldn't touch. 12-month contract. You live on my property in Kenilworth, in a private section with your own entrance. You aren't involved in anything outside your medical duties. And what do I get? Every expense for reconstructive surgery and rehabilitation, however many procedures it takes, however long it takes, with the doctor you choose, not one I choose. Along with that, your student debt. Paid in full, all at once, before you sign. $58,000. Harlow heard the number echo inside her head like a physical sound. She had spent 3 years pushing it down from 62,000 to 58, and this man had just spoken about it as though it were an ordinary expense for the week. Why? 2 reasons. He paused, then gave her both of them. I owe you my life, and I need you. Both are true, and I'm not going to pretend there's only one. It was the first thing anyone had said all day that made Harlow lift her head and look directly into his face. She had spent 4 months surrounded by people telling her things that were easy to hear. Trevor had told her the insurance money was meant to pay her medical bills. Trevor had told her he slept in the small room because of early morning shifts. The man standing in front of her had just handed her the ugliest part of his offer with his own hands, without wrapping it in anything. It's been 3 years, she said. Why are you only coming now? Because if I'd come sooner, you'd be dead. He said nothing else for 3 seconds, then gave her the rest. Someone had wanted him dead that night. That person believed the job had been finished. If Vincenzo had appeared around Harlow, if he'd sent her money, if he'd posted someone outside her building, then within a week someone would have realized that there had been a nurse who had seen his face on the night he was supposed to have been left dead in that parking lot. Anyone who had seen his face that night would have become something that needed to be cleaned up. The only way I could protect you was by staying as far away from you as possible. So I stayed away. Harlow shook her head, not in refusal. Her mind simply couldn't process it fast enough. She looked down at the 2 cards lying side by side on the table, looked at the cold dinner, then back at him. You think because I put 9 stitches in you inside a supply room, I'm going to move into your house? No, then we're done. You think I'm desperate, don't you? You think you came here on the exact day I hit bottom. So I'll say yes to anything you put in front of me. He didn't argue. He didn't tell her she'd misunderstood. Didn't explain himself. Didn't repeat the number 58,000. Didn't point out that there were 2 plates on the table and only one person sitting there. He simply reached out and pushed his card another finger joint toward the center of the table, leaving it beside the old one. Then keep the number. Whether you call or don't call, the contract stays open until you tell me no a second time. He turned and walked toward the door. 3 steps. Then he stopped with one hand on the doorknob and spoke without turning around. One more thing. Harlow waited. The fire in your apartment wasn't caused by an electrical short. The door closed for the 2nd time that day, and this time Harlow stood frozen in the middle of the room, her right hand still resting on the edge of the chair, listening as his footsteps descended the stairs, grew fainter, and finally disappeared. She didn't follow him. She didn't open the door. She stood there for a very long time, and there was only one question inside her head, one she didn't dare ask aloud. If it hadn't been an electrical short, then why, for the last 4 months, had the one person who had never once mentioned the cause been Trevor? The first letter arrived the next morning, tucked into the door slot, the envelope bearing the logo of the property management company. Harlow opened it right there in the hallway. The message was 4 lines long and written in English. No one could misunderstand. The tenant had submitted notice terminating the lease, effective 30 days from the date of signature, and the signature date was the day before yesterday. The landlord acknowledged that the current occupant was not the contracting tenant and requested that the apartment be surrendered by the deadline. She read it twice. Trevor hadn't simply packed his things and left. He had sat down and signed a piece of paper before coming home for that lunch. She called the management office. The woman on the other end was very polite, checked the file, then confirmed that the only name on the lease was Trevor Beckett, that the security deposit was also recorded as having been paid by him, and that if Harlow wanted to sign a new lease in her own name, she would need to prove monthly income equal to 3 times the rent. 3 times $1,150, $3,450 a month. Harlow said thank you and hung up. Her temporary disability benefit was $960 every 2 weeks, and she had 9 weeks left. That afternoon, the 2nd letter arrived. It wasn't from the hospital. It was from a debt collection company in Schaumburg. The medical balance of $31,200, the portion insurance hadn't covered from her acute treatment and 2 specialist follow-up visits, was 120 days overdue and had been transferred to them. The letter stated that the debtor had the right to dispute the debt within 30 days. Beneath that was a smaller line saying the transfer had been reported to the credit bureaus. Harlow sat down on the kitchen floor with both letters in her lap. $240,000. He had looked straight into her eyes and told her that money was for her hospital bills, all of them, and that she didn't have to worry about anything anymore. Not 1 cent had touched the bill she was holding. The next morning, she called the hospital's human resources department to ask about renewing her professional liability coverage. She was told that the malpractice coverage was tied to full-time employment status, that her file had been moved to extended unpaid leave, beginning in the 27th week, and that the coverage had expired at the end of the previous month. To reinstate it, she needed a new employment contract. To get a new employment contract, she needed medical clearance to work. To get medical clearance, she had to pass a range of motion evaluation. Harlow set the phone down on the table. She understood exactly where the circle closed, and she understood that there was no door in that circle for someone who couldn't raise her left shoulder beyond 45 degrees. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, someone knocked on the door. The man outside looked about 50, wore a wool coat, and carried a slim document case. He didn't put his foot in the doorway or rest a hand against the frame. When she opened the door, he stepped back half a pace so she could see both of his hands clearly. "Miss Bellamy, my name is Callum Ruane. I'm here regarding your boyfriend's loan." He's not my boyfriend anymore. I heard. I'm very sorry. He said it as though he truly meant it. That was what made Harlow go cold. Not anything else. Ruane asked whether she would mind if he showed her a few documents, and he waited until she nodded before opening the case. He didn't step inside. He remained in the hallway, turning each page and angling it toward her so she could see. A loan for $180,000, disbursed 2 years earlier in 3 installments. The interest rate was written as a number that made Harlow read it twice. The repayment schedule had stopped in the 14th month. Then he turned to the final page. On the right-hand line was Trevor Beckett's signature, the familiar stroke, the long-drawn T. On the left, beneath the word cosigner, was the name Harlow Bellamy, and a signature that looked like hers. She stared at it for a long time. I never signed this. I believe you, Ruane said, but I'm not the person you need to convince. The person you need to convince is a judge, and that costs money, and you'll have to prove this signature is forged, while the only person who knows for certain that it's forged doesn't want to speak to you. He put the papers back into the case, closed the clasp, and handed her a business card bearing the name of a finance company that sounded perfectly respectable. He told her he hadn't come to bother her, that he understood she was going through a difficult time, and that he would return the following week so the two sides could discuss an arrangement. He wished her a quick recovery. Then he walked down the stairs without hurrying, and she listened to the sound of his shoes on every step. Harlow closed the door. She stood with her back against it and looked around the apartment she would have to surrender in 30 days. She counted everything again in her head, not because she needed to count, but because she needed to give her mind something to do. 30 days, $31,200, already in the hands of a collection company. $180,000 carrying her name on a document she had never touched with a pen. No professional liability coverage, no medical clearance to work, no employment contract, no one in her life to call except one friend, who was already sharing a place with 2 other people. She walked to the dining table. The 2 cards were still there, side by side, exactly where they had been since the day before yesterday. Harlow picked up the phone with her right hand, and she dialed the number. The contract was delivered to the apartment on Monday morning by an attorney, 11 pages, bound together. Harlow read every word of it over 2.5 hours. Clause 1, scope of work, listed exactly what Vincenzo had told her at the dining table that day, and didn't add a single line. Clause 4, 12-month term. Clause 6, medical expenses, stated clearly that Party A would cover them without limit on the number of procedures, and that the treatment facility would be chosen by Party B. Clause 7, the $58,000 student debt would be paid in full in one lump sum before Party B began work, and a copy of the payment receipt would be provided to Party B. There was no clause saying she couldn't speak to anyone. There was no clause saying she had to stay. Harlow had prepared herself to find the trap, and when she couldn't find one, it only made her read more carefully. When she reached the final page, she picked up a pen and added one line by hand beneath her signature. I am your nurse, not your property. I have the right to terminate this contract at any time, without cause, without notice, and without any obligation to reimburse any medical expenses already incurred. She handed it back to the attorney and told him that if that line was crossed out, she wouldn't sign. The attorney read it, hesitated, then made a phone call. He spoke for about 40 seconds, spending most of that time listening in silence. Then he hung up, placed the contract back on the table, and said Mr. Vaccaro wanted the handwritten sentence converted into Clause 12, typed and reprinted, so that it would carry full legal force rather than exist as a note in the margin. The revised copy arrived the following afternoon. Vincenzo had signed the final page, and nothing had been altered. Gabriel Sartori came to pick her up on Thursday morning. He looked a little over 30, spoke very little, and the first thing he did when he saw her carrying a bag in her right hand was ask whether she wanted him to take it, instead of simply grabbing it from her. Harlow said yes, and he nodded, then walked ahead to open the car door. During the 40-minute drive north, he said only 3 sentences, 1 about traffic, and 2 giving directions once they entered the property. The house in Kenilworth was a 3-story gray stone residence at the end of a tree-lined road, discreet enough that from the street, all anyone could see was the perimeter wall. Gabriel took her to the private east wing on the ground floor, with its own entrance, 1 bedroom, and a workroom already fitted with a medication cabinet, a medical refrigerator, and a procedure table. He told her the room had been equipped according to request, and if anything was missing, she should write it down, and it would be there within 2 days. Then he left her alone. Harlow opened the cabinets, took inventory, and began making a list. She worked at it for 3 hours, And during those 3 hours, she didn't think about anything else, which was exactly why she did it. That afternoon, she met Rosalind Vaccaro. The woman was 64 and stood at the far end of the main hallway, and she didn't wait for anyone to introduce them. "You're the nurse." "Yes. Come closer. Let me look at you." Harlow stepped forward. Rosalind studied her for a long time, directly, without avoiding the left side of her face, and there wasn't a trace of pity in that gaze, something Harlow would remember later. "My son has a habit of bringing home things he believes he owes something to," she said. "Usually he brings home dogs. This time he brought home a scarred nurse." Harlow didn't answer. "You understand your place here, don't you? You don't belong in this house. You don't belong at the dinners we have to attend. You don't belong in the photographs people will take at those dinners. And in this family's line of work, those photographs matter far more than you think. I'm not here to have my picture taken. You'll be here long enough to understand why I'm telling you this." Rosalind took half a step back, and not once during the entire conversation did her voice rise. "I don't hate you. I simply don't want my son bringing a debt into this house and calling it kindness. People repay debts with money. When they repay them some other way, it always costs more." Harlow stood there for another 2 seconds. She already had 3 answers in her head, and all 3 were true, and she swallowed every one of them. She had lived through 7 foster homes, and the first thing she'd learned in the second one was that arguing with the person holding the door had never ended well for the person who didn't. She gave a single nod. "Yes, ma'am." Then she turned away, went back to the East Wing, and finished her supply list. That night, she opened her laptop, searched for a shift handoff template, and created a logbook of her own. She made columns for date, time, procedure, person, medication, and reaction. She did it not because anyone had asked her to, but because 4 years in the emergency room had taught her that when things went wrong, the only thing that protected a nurse was what she'd written down. She didn't know that the logbook would save her life. She also didn't know that 3 years earlier, she had already made one exactly like it. Harlow's first patient in that house was the very man who had hired her. Vincenzo came to the workroom on Friday evening, sat down in the chair, and took off his shirt without waiting for her to ask. The old scar along his left side was still exactly where it had always been, and about 2 finger joints behind it, closer to the spine, the skin had turned red and swollen over an area about the size of a coin. Harlow pressed it lightly twice, then asked how long he'd been running a fever in the evenings. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She repeated the number without adding any comment. She took his temperature, reviewed the imaging he handed her, and found exactly what she'd expected to find. A small fragment of metal, not the bullet she'd removed 3 years earlier, but a piece that had broken off when it struck bone, was lodged close to the muscle sheath beside his spine. It had been there for 3 years without causing any trouble. Then it had started causing trouble. "This isn't my job," she said. "It's too close to your spine. You need an operating room and a surgeon. That's being arranged." "Then while it's being arranged, I'll do my part." And she did her part. She incised and drained the superficial abscess in the skin above it, sent the fluid for culture, started broad-spectrum antibiotics according to protocol, then adjusted them when the culture results came back 3 days later. She changed the dressing twice a day, checked his temperature 4 times, and recorded everything in the logbook. During the first 4 days, she noted 3 separate times that if his temperature hadn't come down by the 5th day, transfer would be mandatory. By the 4th day, the fever broke. Vincenzo didn't thank her. He simply asked what else she needed for the medical cabinet. And when she gave him the list, everything on it was there within 48 hours. That house had a rhythm of its own, and Harlow learned it quickly because she was used to working in places that had rhythms of their own. The large dining room in the West Wing was usually lit from around 9 o'clock at night. Cars came through the rear gate. Men arrived in groups of 2 or 3, and no one spoke loudly. Some nights, the doors to that room stayed closed for 4 straight hours. Other nights, they opened after 40 minutes, and everyone walked directly back to their cars. Harlow was never in that hallway during those hours. No one told her to stay away. She stayed away on her own because she understood that in certain places, not seeing something was what kept a person safe. But there were nights when someone knocked on the door of her workroom. The first came during her 2nd week, a man around 40 with a towel wrapped around his hand, standing outside without giving his name. Harlow opened the door, pointed to the chair, and got to work. A deep laceration across the back of the hand, clean edges. She irrigated it, injected local anesthetic, closed it with 7 stitches, gave him a tetanus shot, and told him when to return for suture removal. During those 25 minutes, she asked him exactly 4 questions. Any medication allergies? When was your last tetanus shot? Are you taking blood thinners? "Do you have any numbness in your fingertips?" She didn't ask a fifth question. The man watched her for a long moment as she trimmed the excess suture, then said thank you, and left. After that came a second man, a third, a fifth. There was a young man around 25 who arrived with an oil burn on his forearm, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold a cup of water, and Harlow sat beside him and waited 10 minutes for the shaking to stop before she began. There was another man who came at 2 o'clock in the morning with a wound he'd tried to close himself with glue, now infected, and she had to reopen the entire thing. She told him not to do that again. And it was the only reproachful thing she said to anyone during her first 3 months there. Her rules were simple, and she never announced them to anyone. She treated anyone who was bleeding. She didn't ask why they were bleeding. She wrote down what she did, not what she suspected. And if a case was beyond her skill, she said so plainly from the very first minute, no matter who was standing in front of her. Gabriel Sartori was the first person to notice that. He began by standing outside the door on nights when someone came late, saying nothing, simply standing there. Then he started bringing coffee. Then one night, after the last patient had gone, he said the longest thing he'd ever said to her. "There were 3 people doing this before you. The first sold medication outside. The second talked to the press. The third asked too many questions." Harlow pulled off her gloves, dropped them into the bin, and didn't ask where those 3 people were now. Gabriel nodded, as though the fact that she hadn't asked was the answer he'd needed. There was one other person in that house who noticed her, and that man never knocked on her door. He looked to be in his late 50s, came on the nights when meetings were held, always arrived alone, and was always the last person to enter the dining room. Gabriel called him Mr. Corso. The first time Harlow passed him in the main hallway, she dipped her head politely and kept walking. He didn't return the greeting. He simply stopped and watched her pass, and she could feel his gaze against the back of her neck for the rest of the hallway. It happened again the second time, then the third. He had never spoken a single word to her. That night, Harlow wrote exactly 1 line in the notes column of her logbook, in small handwriting. "Mr. C. watches too long." Then she closed the book and went to bed. And she didn't think about it anymore, because she had learned a long time ago that some things only kept you awake the more you thought about them, and morning still came whether you slept or not, and tomorrow she would still have to get up and work. Dr. Adele Krauss took Harlow's case back as soon as the payment authorization was confirmed. She didn't ask where the money had come from. She simply reopened the old scans, measured Harlow's range of motion again, and scheduled a 90-minute consultation, longer than any appointment they'd had before. "I'm going to do 3 things in the same surgery," she said. "Release the contracture band across the axillary fold, release the flexion contracture at the elbow, and place a full-thickness skin graft on the neck." She explained each part in clinical terms because she knew Harlow understood them, and because from the beginning she had promised to speak to her the way she would speak to a colleague. Then she closed the chart and gave her the rest. "Now I need you to listen very carefully to this part, and I need you to answer me before you get on that table, not afterward." Harlow nodded. "This surgery will make a significant improvement. I expect the abduction in your left shoulder to increase by about 20 degrees after you've completed 9 months of rehabilitation. The tissue in your neck will be softer, and you'll be able to turn your head farther to the left. The color and texture should improve too." She paused. "But it won't take you back to where you were. No surgery will take you back to where you were. If you go into that operating room hoping to wake up and find the person you were 4 months ago, you'll walk out of here with a good surgical result and a broken heart, and I've seen that happen enough times that I don't want to watch it happen again. What do you want me to say? I want you to tell me you understand what you're about to trade 9 hours on an operating table to get, not your old face. 20 degrees. Harlow sat very still for a long time. She had read enough medical charts in her life to know what 20 degrees meant on paper. She also knew what it meant in a person's life. It meant reaching for a box on top of the refrigerator by herself. It meant putting on a coat without having to twist her body through an awkward detour. It meant carrying an instrument tray with 2 hands instead of 1. None of those things showed up in photographs. Every one of them showed up every day. "I understand," she said. "I'm trading 9 hours for 20 degrees. I consent." Krauss wrote a single word in the chart and stood. "Good. I like patients who know what they're buying." The surgery was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Gabriel drove her to the hospital at 5:15. Neither of them said anything in the car. At admissions, she filled out the paperwork with her right hand, signed her name, handed over her new insurance card, and when she reached the box for emergency contact, her pen stopped for about 4 seconds. 4 months earlier, that space had held the name Trevor Beckett. She wrote Jenna Whitaker. Then she crossed it out and added a second phone number underneath. the number she'd memorized from the white card. The admissions nurse took the form, glanced over it, and didn't ask any questions. The surgery began at 7:20. Harlow counted backward from 10, and she remembered making it to 6. She woke in the recovery room, drifted under again, then woke a second time in another room, and this time the light beyond the window had taken on the color of late afternoon. Her neck was immobilized in a brace. Her left arm was held out in an abducted position by a support bar. Her mouth was dry. She stayed still for a while and let her body catch up with her, exactly the way she had always told her own patients to do. Then she moved her eyes to the right because her neck wouldn't turn. Vincenzo was sitting in the corner of the room on the plastic chair meant for family members, both hands resting on his knees. He was still wearing the suit from the day before, the same shirt, now wrinkled at the elbows, with the top button of the collar undone. Beside the leg of the chair was a paper coffee cup that had been empty for a long time. He didn't stand when he saw her open her eyes. He didn't come closer to the bed. He only straightened slightly in his chair. The doctor said it's done. Harlow tried to speak, but no sound came out. She tried a second time. What time is it? 4:40. 9 hours and 20 minutes. She closed her eyes and did the math. And when she opened them again, the number was still the same. This man had been sitting in that plastic chair since before 7:20 that morning. He wasn't holding a phone. No one was sitting with him. There was nothing in the room to suggest he'd stepped out to do anything else. Harlow thought of an afternoon 4 months earlier, of a hand holding her right hand, of a man crying real tears and saying every appointment, every surgery, however long it takes. She had believed that sentence. She had lived on that sentence for 4 months. "You didn't have to stay," she said. "I know." He didn't say anything more. He didn't say he wanted to stay, didn't say he owed her, didn't mention the contract, didn't ask whether she felt better. He simply stood, walked to the door, told someone in the hallway that the patient was awake and needed a nurse, then came back and sat down in the exact same chair. Harlow lay there staring at the ceiling. Trevor had promised he would be there and hadn't come. This man hadn't promised anything at all. He had simply sat there for 9 hours. 3 weeks after the surgery, when Harlow had stopped wearing the neck brace and begun her first range of motion exercises, Vincenzo knocked on the door of her workroom one evening. He was carrying a file about 2 finger joints thick, and he set it down on the procedure table. "Sit down first." She sat. He opened the file, turned it toward her, then stepped back and leaned against the supply cabinet. He didn't say another word for the next 40 minutes. The first page was a copy of the loan agreement. The lender was a finance company legally registered in Illinois, with Callum Ruane named as the signing representative. The borrower was Trevor Beckett. The amount was $180,000, dispersed in 3 installments over 5 months. Harlow had seen this page in the hallway of her old apartment, but that time Ruane had only held it up for her to look at for about 10 seconds. This time she had time to read. She reached the repayment schedule and saw that it stopped in the 14th month. After that came 11 blank months. The next page was a statement from Trevor's account during that same period. There were expenses Harlow recognized. There were others she didn't recognize, and they were much larger. She saw the names of 4 casinos within 40 miles of Chicago, appearing again and again over 18 months, and she understood that those deals that were always about to close had never been what was swallowing that man's money. The next page was an extraction of text messages. There was the stamp of a legal services firm in one corner, and a column clearly listing dates and times in Central Time. Harlow read from top to bottom. The first messages were polite, reminders, requests to meet. Then the tone changed. Then came a message highlighted in yellow, sent at 10:21 in the evening, and Harlow read it 3 times. It was short. It said this was the final reminder. It said that if there was no movement within 2 weeks, the lender would transfer the file to asset recovery. And it ended with one sentence written in language anyone could understand, saying that the recovery department didn't work through letters, and that he should consider the possibility that his property might not remain intact. Beneath that message was a small notation added by the extraction service. Status, read. Time read, 10:23 that same evening. Harlow looked across to the date column. Then she opened the next page, a copy of the fire investigation report, and found the date in the upper right corner. She placed the 2 pages side by side on the procedure table and counted. 13 days. She counted again. Still 13. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the hallway, someone walked past, and the footsteps faded away. Harlow sat staring at those 2 dates, and there were no thoughts in her head, only a list. The first night, she had been working. The second night, she had come home at 7:30 in the morning and he'd already made coffee. The fourth night, she'd cooked noodles for both of them and he'd eaten every bite of his portion. The 7th night, she'd asked if something was wrong because he looked tired, and he'd said nothing was wrong. The 9th night, he'd lain beside her and talked about going somewhere in the summer. The 13th night, he'd come home late, drunk, stumbled into the kitchen chair, and told her he would sleep in the room at the end of the hall so he wouldn't disturb her. 13 times he had watched her walk into the bedroom and close the door. 13 times he had known that message was sitting inside his phone. Harlow said nothing. She turned the page. The next document was Trevor's statement to the fire investigators, recording that he didn't know the cause, that he had no disputes with anyone, that he hadn't received any threats. At the bottom of the page was a checked box beside the question, asking whether the person giving the statement knew of any reason the property might have been targeted. The box marked no was checked. Harlow understood why. If he told the truth, he would have to disclose the loan. If he disclosed the loan, he would have to disclose 18 months of gambling. Once he did that, the building owner's liability insurer wouldn't have paid a cent, because the case would have shifted from a technical incident to a suspected crime, and because insurance companies always looked for ways not to pay. The final page in the file was a wire transfer order. $240,000 from Trevor Beckett's account to a business account that 3 pages earlier had been clearly identified as controlled by Callum Ruane. The transfer had been made 9 days after the settlement funds were released. The balance remaining in Trevor's account after the transaction was $4,300. Harlow closed the file. She didn't slam it shut. She simply lowered the cover, placed both hands on top of it, and sat still. She stayed that way for a very long time. Vincenzo said nothing. He didn't ask whether she was all right, didn't tell her he was sorry, didn't offer a single opinion about the man inside that file. He simply remained where he was, leaning against the supply cabinet, and waited. Finally, Harlow looked up. Her eyes were dry. Her voice was so normal that even she found it strange. "Let me borrow this. It's yours. I want his office address." Vincenzo looked at her for about 2 seconds. Then he took out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and read the address to her in an even voice, as though he were reading a line from a directory. The next morning, Gabriel drove her to the South Loop. Vincenzo walked her all the way to the car and said exactly 2 sentences. "Gabriel will wait outside. You decide when you want to come out." He didn't ask what she planned to say. He didn't tell her not to do anything. He didn't go with her. The office was on the 4th floor, a row of low desks with several small glass rooms along one side. The receptionist asked whether she had an appointment, and Harlow said she was Harlow Bellamy. She said the name in an ordinary voice, and she watched it travel across the room faster than any appointment slip could have. Trevor came out of the glass office at the far end about 40 seconds later. He didn't invite her inside. He walked straight to where she was standing, and the first thing he did was glance around to see whether anyone was watching. "What are you doing here?" "Talking." "I'm working." "Then we'll talk here." He took her into a small conference room and closed the door. Harlow placed the file on the table. She didn't open it. She simply rested one hand on top and looked at him. $180,000. Callum Ruane. You stopped making payments in the 14th month. Something around Trevor's mouth changed. "Who gave you that?" "That doesn't matter." "Yes, it does. It matters a lot. You're holding documents ordinary people can't get, Harlow. Who are you getting involved with?" $240,000. 9 days after the insurance money came through, transferred straight into his account. $4,300 left. You don't understand any of this. I have a hospital bill for $31,200 sitting with a collection company in Schaumburg. You told me that money was going to pay my medical bills. You looked me straight in the face and said it. Trevor started pacing. He said she had no idea what kind of pressure he'd been under. He said the real estate business had collapsed 2 years earlier, and no one in that office had been making any money. He said the loan had originally been meant to save a deal, that he'd planned to repay it within 6 months, that everything had slipped out of control because of circumstances beyond his hands. Harlow let him finish. Then she opened the file, turned directly to the page marked in yellow, and rotated it toward him. 10:21 at night. You read it at 10:23. Trevor looked down at the page. He didn't pick it up. 13 days later, the apartment burned. He took half a step backward. You can't talk like that. I haven't said anything. I've only read 2 dates. I didn't know they were going to do that. His voice broke in the middle of the sentence, and once it did, he couldn't stop. I didn't tell them to burn anything. Do you hear me? I didn't tell anyone to do that. I thought they were bluffing. People send messages like that all the time. They threaten you so you'll panic and find the money. Nobody actually goes and burns down a building. The room went silent after that. Trevor heard his own words, and the color drained from his face. Harlow didn't shout. She didn't stand up. She remained seated with both hands resting on the file, and asked him one question in an ordinary voice. 13 nights. Every night, you watched me walk into the bedroom and close the door in that apartment. She paused. What were you thinking? Trevor opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He tried again. He managed 2 words. I thought. And then stopped. And in that silence, Harlow saw everything she needed to see. He had no answer because during those 13 nights, he hadn't been thinking anything at all. That was the worst part. Not calculation. Not thinking about her. She stood, picked up the file, and walked toward the door. Harlow. She stopped with one hand on the doorknob. What are you going to do with those papers? She looked at him one last time. I don't know, but I noticed you asked me that before you asked how my arm was. She opened the door and walked out. Sienna Marsh was waiting for her in the lobby downstairs. She stood beside a column with her bag held against her body and looked as though she'd been there for quite a while. When Harlow stepped out of the elevator, Sienna moved forward 2 steps, then stopped, and Harlow saw her eyes touch the left side of her face before quickly turning away. You're Harlow. Yes, I'm Sienna. She drew a breath. I saw your name on a document in his briefcase. It said cosigner. I asked him about it, and he told me you were an old roommate, that you'd asked him to sign for you back then. Harlow said nothing. He told me your apartment burned. He said you didn't have anyone, so he helped you for a few months. Sienna looked down at the floor. Is that what happened? No, Harlow said. She didn't explain further. Sienna stood still for a long time, and when she finally looked up, her eyes were red. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I really didn't know any of it. Harlow looked at the 24-year-old woman standing in front of her and understood something very clearly. This woman wasn't the person who had taken anything from her. She was only the next person who had been told a story. I'm not angry with you, Harlow said. You only heard the version he wanted you to hear. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Harlow hadn't expected herself to get used to. She went to physical therapy 4 times a week, and after every session she measured her range of motion again and wrote it in her logbook. She worked in the evenings. She slept more than she had before. Vincenzo came to her room twice a week so she could check the incision from the drainage procedure, now nearly healed. And except for the moments when she needed to place her hands on his back to examine him, he never touched her. He never stood any closer than necessary. When she dropped a roll of tape and bent down to pick it up, he waited for her to retrieve it instead of bending down with her. Once, she had to reach for a box of gauze on a high shelf, and he noticed. He didn't take it down for her. He only asked whether she wanted him to have that shelf lowered. She said yes. The next day, the shelf was at shoulder height. On the 4th night of the 5th week, Harlow woke close to 3 o'clock because she smelled smoke. She shot upright in bed, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, and rolled onto the floor with the same reflex that had saved her life 4 months earlier. There was no smoke. There was nothing at all. The room was dark, the windows closed, the air purifier humming steadily. She crawled to the door and opened it, because she needed to see the hallway, and she sat down hard in the doorway and breathed. She didn't scream. She didn't call anyone, but 7 minutes later, Vincenzo appeared at the far end of the hall. He walked toward her, stopped about 3 steps from her door, and sat down on the floor with his back against the opposite wall. He didn't come inside. He didn't ask whether she was all right. Go back to bed. All right. He said all right, and he didn't leave. Harlow didn't have enough strength to argue. She moved back inside, left the door partly open, and lay down on the floor just inside the threshold, because it was the only place she could tolerate being. She didn't know when she fell asleep again. When she opened her eyes, morning had come, the hallway was empty, and on the floor opposite her door sat a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, placed neatly against the base of the wall. The following Tuesday morning, Gabriel knocked on the door of her workroom before 7 o'clock. He said Mr. Vaccaro wanted to see her, and he said it in a tone different from any he'd used before. Vincenzo was already sitting in the 2nd floor study. On the desk lay a new file, thinner than the last one. He didn't push it toward her right away. I was wrong about one thing, he said. I thought Ruane made the decision himself. Gabriel gave her the rest, because that was the part he had gone looking for. Trevor Beckett's loan hadn't come through Ruane's ordinary business. It had been brought in. There had been someone in the middle, and that person had gone looking for Trevor first, not the other way around. They gave money to a man who was losing at gambling, gave it easily, gave him more than he'd asked for, at an interest rate anyone thinking clearly would have known he could never repay. It wasn't lending, it was building a rope, putting it around someone's neck, and waiting. Then Gabriel placed a sheet of dates on the desk, and Harlow looked at it and saw that the first disbursement had been made about 3 months after the night she'd put 9 stitches into a stranger in a supply room. Who? She asked. Vincenzo took a moment before answering. Rocco Corso. He said the name once, and didn't repeat it. 3 years earlier, He had been the one who arranged what happened in the parking lot. He had held an advisory position in the family for 20 years, understood exactly where he would stand if the man at the top disappeared, and had believed everything was finished that night. Vincenzo vanished from Chicago for 10 months afterward, and when he returned changed. And Rocco understood that something had failed to happen according to plan. A man shot in the side didn't stitch himself closed with 9 sutures of 3/0 thread. Someone had to have been there. And if someone had been there, then that person had been beside Vincenzo while he was bleeding, drifting in and out of consciousness, unable to control what he might say. Rocco spent 3 years finding that person, and eventually he found a night shift nurse at a public hospital on the south side of the city. He couldn't touch her there. If a public hospital nurse died under suspicious circumstances, there would be a union, local reporters, police who had to open a case, so he didn't touch her. He went looking for the man who lived with her, and he loaned that man $180,000. Then he waited 14 months. Then he tightened the rope. And when Trevor Beckett couldn't pay, burning an apartment in Bridgeport at 3 o'clock in the morning became something that anyone looking at it would understand in only one way: the consequence of a debt. No one would go searching for another reason. No one would ask why that particular apartment. Harlow sat there for a long time. She thought about the bed in the bedroom, and the 11 steps from there to the front door, and the room at the end of the hall where Trevor had slept, because he was drunk. If he hadn't been drunk that night, if he had slept in the bedroom beside her, closer to the exit, then she wouldn't have had to go back inside. And she understood that for 4 months, she had been asking the wrong question. For 4 months, she had believed her face was the price of loving the wrong person. It turned out it was the price of saving a stranger at 2 o'clock in the morning and never asking who he was. Harlow's next follow-up appointment was on a Thursday afternoon, at the very hospital where she had once worked. She drove there alone because she'd told Gabriel she wanted to go by herself, and because Gabriel was the kind of man who knew when not to argue. She parked in the employee lot behind the emergency department, the same place she'd parked for 4 years, because her badge still worked at the gate. By the time she came back out, darkness had fallen, and the lot was nearly empty. Rocco Corso was standing beside her car. He stood slightly toward the front of the vehicle, his hands empty, and he didn't move closer when she approached. Harlow stopped about 4 steps away. She said nothing. He didn't greet her either. He simply reached inside his coat, took out a brown paper envelope, and placed it on the hood of her car. Then he stepped back once to give her room. Harlow looked at the envelope. She looked at him. Then she stepped forward and opened it. Inside were photographs. The first showed Jenna Whitaker walking through the employee entrance of the emergency department with a coffee cup in her hand, photographed from about 100 feet away. The second showed Margot Kessler opening her car door in a residential parking area, with the house number visible behind her. The third showed Dr. Adele Krause leaving the entrance of her private practice in Evanston, with a handbag in her hand. The time stamped in the corner of the photograph, reading 7:12 in the evening. There were 4 more. Harlow didn't look through all of them. She stacked the photographs together, set the envelope back on the hood, and realized her hand wasn't shaking, though she didn't understand why. "What do you want?" Rocco answered in the voice of a man explaining something simple to someone he considered intelligent enough to understand it. "I want you to leave Chicago, because I know what happened 3 years ago. You don't know anything. That's not the problem." He pointed toward the envelope. "The problem is him. I've sat beside that family for 20 years. I know how he thinks, and I know what will ruin him." He paused. "You leave this city, and everyone in that envelope stays safe. You stay, and sooner or later, there will come a day when he has to choose between you and the family, and he'll choose you. That's when he dies, Miss Bellamy, and people will say it happened because he was weak. No one will say it happened because of you." He buttoned his coat again. "I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you the price of staying. You're the one who does the calculation, not me." Then he walked away. He didn't look back once. Harlow stood beside her car in that parking lot for about 10 minutes, in the exact place where 3 years earlier she had heard a breath in the darkness, and turned toward it, instead of continuing on her way. That night she returned to Kenilworth, went straight to her room, and sat down at the table. She took out the contract and turned to Clause 12, the clause she'd written herself in pen, and they'd typed into the final version for her. No reason required, no notice required. She signed the termination section, folded the document, and placed it on the procedure table beside a complete inventory handoff, the remaining medication counts, and 3 pages of notes about Vincenzo's incision and the follow-up schedule his replacement would need to know. She didn't write a letter. She couldn't think of a single sentence that wouldn't have been a lie. The next morning, she called Jenna. By noon, she was in the apartment Jenna shared with 2 other people in Pilsen, sleeping on a folding bed in the living room. Within 9 days, she applied to 4 places and received 1 call. Bridgeport Community Clinic, a nonprofit that provided free care to people without insurance, needed a nurse 3 shifts a week at a salary 40% lower than what Harlow had earned before. The work was dressing changes, injections, blood pressure checks, diabetes screening, and explaining to people what the piece of paper their doctor had just handed them actually meant. No one there needed her to lift a patient. The manager looked at the left side of Harlow's face exactly once during the interview, then lowered her eyes to the resume and asked whether Harlow could work evenings. Vincenzo found her in the 3rd week. He didn't come to the clinic. He waited in the lobby of Jenna's building, standing outside the glass doors, and when Harlow came home from work, he was already there. He didn't step inside. "You terminated the contract." "Yes, that clause was yours. I'm not contesting it," he said. "But I want to hear the reason." Harlow was silent. She had prepared 3 answers on the way home, and all 3 of them were harmless. She wanted to be independent. She felt she'd stayed long enough. She needed a normal life. She stood there facing the man who had sat for 9 hours in a plastic chair, and she couldn't make herself say any of them. "I have my reasons," she said. "I can't tell you." Vincenzo looked at her for a long time. Then he said the one thing he'd come there to say. "I don't need you to protect me." He paused. "But I need you to tell me the truth. That's the only difference between me and him." Harlow didn't answer him that evening, but 10 days later, an invitation arrived at the clinic, addressed directly to her, and sent through no one else. It was for the 15th anniversary memorial of Mr. Vaccaro's death, to be held at a church in Kenilworth, followed by a gathering at the house. In the lower corner, written by hand in blue ink, was a short line. "My son doesn't know I sent this. Whether you come is up to you." Signed, Rosalind Vaccaro. Harlow went. She didn't know why she went, and it would take her a long time before she could answer that question. The gathering was held in the large room in the West Wing, with around 60 people, most of them standing in small groups. Harlow stayed near the door. She saw Gabriel nod to her from across the room. She caught sight of Vincenzo once over someone else's shoulder, and he didn't come toward her. Rosalind stood in the middle of the room for an entire hour, receiving one group of guests after another, her back straight, and she didn't sit down once. At around 9 o'clock that evening, Harlow saw her lift a hand and touch the area above her breastbone. Just once, very quickly, then her hand dropped again. 3 minutes later, she did it a second time. Harlow set down her glass of water and started moving through the crowd. She hadn't reached Rosalind when the woman collapsed. She didn't clutch her chest. She didn't cry out. She simply buckled to one side and fell forward, and the voices around her broke into a useless wall of noise. Someone dropped to their knees and called her name. Someone shouted for water. Someone else said no one should touch her. Harlow moved past 2 people and knelt beside her, and her voice cut through the room with the volume 4 years in the emergency room had taught her to use. "I'm a nurse. Step back." She tilted Rosalind's head back, lifted her chin, lowered her ear close while watching the rise and fall of the chest. No normal breathing. She placed 2 fingers against the carotid artery and counted for 10 seconds. No pulse. She looked up and pointed directly at the nearest man. "You, call 911. Tell them adult cardiac arrest, chest compressions in progress. Give them this address. When you're done, tell me." She pointed to a second person. "You, go to the gate and wait for the ambulance. Bring them in through the main entrance. Go now." Then she pointed at Gabriel. "Defibrillator. If this house has one, get it. If it doesn't, don't waste time looking." She stacked both hands over the lower half of Rosalind's sternum and began compressions. She drove the force from her hips and right shoulder, locking her elbows, and by the 15th compression, her left shoulder had begun to protest. She didn't stop. She counted aloud to hold the rhythm, counted all the way to 30, checked the airway, then started compressions again. 2 minutes, then 4. Someone offered to take over and she said no, because switching people at that moment risked an interruption, and because she was the only person in the room who knew exactly what she was doing. By the 6th minute, sweat was running down her chin, and her left arm hurt so badly she could no longer feel her hand, and she kept counting. The paramedics arrived at the 8th minute. Harlow gave her report in 3 short sentences. The time Rosalind collapsed, the time compressions began, the condition of the airway, then stepped back and sat down hard on the floor until someone helped her stand. Rosalind Vaccaro had a stent placed that night. She regained consciousness around noon the next day. Harlow stayed at the hospital all night, not inside the room but on the row of chairs in the hallway, and she stayed because she couldn't think of a reason to leave. Early that afternoon, a nurse came out and called for her. Inside the room there was only Rosalind and the monitor. She turned her head toward the door when Harlow entered, and she looked at her. She looked directly at the left side of Harlow's face. She didn't glance over it. She didn't pause for half a second, and then let her eyes fall to the floor. She looked at it, and held her gaze there long enough to make an ordinary person uncomfortable. Then she spoke, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube. "I judged you wrong." She didn't apologize. She didn't say she'd been wrong about everything. Didn't take back what she'd said about photographs. Didn't invite Harlow to return to the house. She said only that one sentence, then closed her eyes because she was tired. Harlow stood there a little longer. It was the first time in 4 months that someone had looked at her scar without looking away. She drove back to Pilsen at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and at a red light on Ashland, a thought dropped into her mind so suddenly that she nearly missed the light turning green. The notebook. 3 years earlier, after that night shift, she had done exactly what she always did after every shift. She had written it down, not in the hospital system, because there had been no patient record. In the private notebook she used to keep track of things she needed to remember. Date, time, wound location, medications used, number of sutures, suture size. And before leaving the supply room that night, she had put the bullet into a specimen container, labeled it, written the date, and in the source field written 2 words, unknown origin, then placed it inside the metal lockbox in her personal locker, which she had taken home along with her belongings after the fire. She had never opened that box since. Harlow sat in the car at the side of the road and thought very carefully, because she understood exactly what she had and exactly what she didn't have. A bullet that had spent 3 years inside a personal locker had no chain of custody. There was no seizure record, no evidence seal, no one who had signed for it, no prosecutor could put it in front of a jury. On top of that, the shooting had happened 3 years earlier, and no one had ever reported it. It couldn't convict anyone of anything, but it didn't need to convict anyone. It proved something else. It proved that night had been real, proved who the man lying there had been, and proved that 3 years later, the man who had ordered what happened that night had a reason to burn an apartment in Bridgeport. Harlow called Vincenzo that evening and told him everything she had been holding back. The envelope of photographs in the parking lot, what Rocco had said about the day Vincenzo would have to choose, and the real reason she had signed Clause 12. Then she told him about the notebook and the specimen container in her locker. 4 days later, the family council met in the West Wing dining room, 9 people seated around the table, and Rocco Corso sat in the place he had occupied for 20 years. Vincenzo never raised his voice. He placed each item on the table one by one. The notebook, already open to the page dated 3 years earlier, written in a nurse's handwriting, with the time, the suture size, the number of stitches, the specimen container labeled unknown origin, the $180,000 loan agreement bearing the names Callum Ruane and Trevor Beckett, along with a timeline showing that the first disbursement had been made 3 months after the night, in the parking lot. The warning message sent at 10:21 that evening, the fire investigation report dated 13 days later, and the order transferring $240,000 into an account controlled by Ruane. No one in the room said anything. Rocco tried to speak when Vincenzo reached the 4th page, and Vincenzo raised one hand, barely a finger joint, and Rocco fell silent. Only when the final document had been placed on the table did Vincenzo look directly at him, and he said exactly 3 sentences. "You had me shot. I can live with that." He paused. "You burned down a nurse's home because she dared to bandage me. I can't live with that." The council voted before midnight. Rocco Corso was stripped of every role, cut off from every financial interest, and not one of the 9 people sitting at that table stepped forward to defend him with so much as a sentence. What happened next didn't happen in that room. The following morning, the family's attorney brought the entire file to the United States Attorney's Office in Chicago, along with a statement from Gabriel Sartori and a signed account from Harlow. The Federal Bureau of Investigation spent 7 months reconstructing the operation. The final indictment contained 2 principal charges: arson resulting in bodily injury and organized usury, along with a series of charges involving money laundering and insurance fraud. Callum Ruane pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, and identified the man who had brought the loan to him. Rocco Corso went to trial and pleaded not guilty. He lost. During those 7 months, Vincenzo used the case itself to accelerate something he had already begun, cutting away the parts of the organization that couldn't survive in daylight and moving what remained into legitimate legal entities. He told the council that an organization whose advisor could burn down an ordinary person's home just to keep his seat didn't need enemies anymore. No one argued with him. Trevor Beckett's name appeared in the indictment in the background section, identified as the borrower and as the man who had given false information to fire investigators. He wasn't criminally charged, but the records became public, and Sienna Marsh read them. She compared the dates. She compared the day he'd shaken her hand inside the 9th-floor model apartment with the day the other woman was still changing her dressings twice a day, and she moved out that same week. 3 weeks later, Trevor came to Bridgeport Community Clinic in the middle of the afternoon, with someone beside him, holding up a phone and recording. There were 11 patients in the waiting room that day. He stood in the middle of the room and apologized, loudly and at length, saying he'd been a coward, saying he'd been afraid, saying this woman had saved his life, and he'd abandoned her. Then he asked, "Can you tell everyone you forgive me?" Harlow was changing the dressing of an elderly man at table number 2. She finished tying the last knot, pulled off her gloves, dropped them into the bin, and only then stood upright. "You didn't come here because of me," she said. "You came because no one believes your version anymore." She looked at the phone recording them, then back at him. "I don't forgive you. I don't hate you either, because hating you takes more strength than I have to spare. Now leave. There are people here waiting to be seen." The video was posted online the next day. It didn't save him. 14 months later, Harlow had gone through 3 more surgeries, bringing the total to 4. The abduction in her left shoulder stopped at about 70 degrees and wouldn't go any farther. The scars along the left side of her face and neck had become softer, flatter, their color fading with every passing year. And they were still there, and she used nothing to hide them. She was the head nurse at Bellamy Vaccaro Community Clinic on the south side of Chicago, a nonprofit facility providing free medical care to people without insurance, funded by a legitimate foundation established by the Vaccaro family after the case. Many of the patients who walked through those doors were people who had once been driven into the hands of men like Callum Ruane. Vincenzo proposed to her one September evening in the backyard behind the clinic after closing time. He didn't tell her that he had saved her. "I didn't save you," he said. "You crawled back into a burning building before you even knew I existed. You went back to work when you were afraid people would look at you. I was only lucky enough to be standing there to see it." The wedding was small, held in the yard, with about 40 guests. Jenna Whitaker stood beside her. Margot Kessler and Dr. Adele Krause sat at the same table. Gabriel Sartori guarded the door the way he always had. Rosalind Vaccaro sat in the front row, her back straight, and she didn't look away even once. Not a single photograph was retouched. Harlow's story leaves us with a few very simple truths. Kindness isn't alone, and anyone who turns the help they've received into a burden they need to run from has never truly loved anyone. A person's worth isn't found in the face they carry through the world, but in what they choose to do when no one is forcing them to do anything. Being abandoned doesn't prove that we're unworthy. It only proves that the person who abandoned us was capable of loving only the parts that were easy to love. And sometimes respecting another human being is as simple as looking directly at them without turning your face away. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with the people you love so we can continue listening together to more compelling stories every day. How did Harlow's story make you feel? And do you see any reflection of it somewhere in the life around you? Leave a comment below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.